Hey YouTube, Kevin Cleary with a knife video for you. This should be a fun video. I'm going to do a comparison here, and the comparison is going to be between the XM18 and the Zero Tolerance 0562. Now I also have, just for comparison's sake, the 0560, which is the original ZT Hinderer collaboration. The initial one based off this, even though this is closer in size to an XM24, we'll maybe draw that in for a comparison from time to time, okay? Now, what I do want to say is this by way of introduction, okay? These two knives are very similar, although it should be pointed out that the price point is quite different, okay? More than double for an XM18 compared to the G10 Zero Tolerance. And this one, I will say, with the carbon fiber and the M390, and I have added aftermarket titanium hardware to this, is a little closer, probably all told. I've got a little under $300 in this, okay? Now, on the other hand, you know, this guy you're looking at about $475 right now is a fair price. And they're coming down in price, okay? They were, you know, crazy, like $600 or something. That's not what you're looking at anymore. So that gets the price discussion out of the way. I will make some points as we go along about some of the other differences. And I'm going to make a totally new video about this, but maybe I'll raise some points along those lines in here about why bother, you know, paying the extra for a knife like this that's sort of high-end production versus something like this that is still pretty high-end production, just made in larger numbers and in a factory rather than in sort of a small shop. And you know, at this point we probably even have to ask if Hinderer still qualifies as that after they've moved to the larger facility, okay? So there's all of that discussion to be had, and you know, I won't be able to delve into that fully. I will do a totally different video about that where I'll bring in a couple of different mid-techs that I really like, that obviously I thought were worth the extra money, okay? So you'll see that video coming up in a few weeks. For this video though, let's focus on these two knives, and number one, what are the differences? What are you getting in this one over that one, this one over this one? What one would you be interested in and why? And so to start that discussion off, we're going to go with size and weight. This is normally what we talk about first. So size and weight on the XM18 is 3.5 inch blade, 8 1/4 inches overall, 4 3/4 inch handle, and 5.7 ounces. Now, one further number that I should point out, this is over ½ inch thick. It's about 5/16 thick, okay? So that's the size and weight on the XM18. Let's compare that to the very, very similar size and weight on the 0562. The size on this is 8 1/4 inches overall, exact same, 3.5 inch blade, exact same, 4 3/4 inch handle, exact same, 5.45 ounces. So just a little under, you know, literally like 0.3 ounces less, okay? Not a whole lot of difference in weight there. Okay, and by the way, I think that could actually be even better if they milled out the stainless clip on this side, or if they milled out some of the titanium handle. They could probably get this down to close to 5 ounces, which then would make this an even better knife than it is. I still think it's a great knife, but anyway, 5.45 ounces. And this is basically right at ½ inch, okay? Now, I will add that because of the smoothness of this, it does go in and out of pocket fairly easily, okay? And that's one of the things we need to talk about here. Now, this is gonna be somewhat a matter of personal preference, but these are very, very close in size and weight. Now, but I'm gonna say this. This knife, you will feel it more in your pocket. You'll notice it more when you're carrying it. However, when you get it in hand, it's going to feel very beefy and very hand-filling and very confidence-inspiring, okay? On the other hand, this knife you will barely feel in your pocket, although when you get it in hand, it won't have quite the same feeling of confident grip. It doesn't feel like it was just meant to be in your hand, where the Hinderer definitely does have that just super natural, super comfortable feel to it. Now, let me add something that's going to mess this up just a little bit. The 0560 because of the 3D machining, feels amazing in hand. Okay, it feels like it's just an extension of you. Now, I will say it is a bigger knife. So if you prefer something larger, you may want to skip both of these and go to the 0560, which is a phenomenal knife. Okay, I really like the 0560. Now, I'm not going to bring that in a whole lot because we are going to focus on these. So that's where you have to kind of consider. This feels very, very good in hand. It's very hand feeling. It feels good. The ergonomics are great. I'm not complaining. But it's not the same, okay? This feels more substantial, even though it's only 0.3 ounces difference in weight, all right? Now, by the way, that 0.3 ounces is pretty easily accounted for when you look at the thickness on these scales, okay? Also, the inside scale here on the 0560 is not titanium, it's stainless steel. And so that's gonna affect the weight a little bit as well. So that's the size and weight, and I've really got to call it, sorry about that, I've really got to call it a tie on size and weight. I don't think one is so much different that it's worth saying one is better than the other. And especially, I don't think, there's a matter of personal preference here. Would you rather have a knife that's more hand-filling, that's a little more confidence-inspiring and has a feeling of greater durability, or would you rather have one that carries a little nicer and feels maybe a little more polished in your hand? So that's a matter really of personal preference. Now let's go on to the blade, okay? Because the blade is something that's a little more different. We'll start with the XM18 blade. Now there are a couple of options that are out there now. This is the original Spanto style blade, which is that combination of spear point tanto. You can get this in a Skinner, you can get it in a clip point now, and a slicer grind, okay? So you need to kind of keep all those in the back of your mind. This is based on the slicer grind, all right? And we'll make some comments about that when we get to that blade. So this blade, though, is 3.5 inches. You are losing a bit of cutting edge for that front choil, okay? So you end up with like 3.25 inches of cutting edge. It is very, very strong. There's a lot of material out here at the tip, and it's a moderately thick grind, okay? Now, what's cool about this is, or what's impressive about this, is that this knife still cuts well. They've gotten it thin enough behind the edge to cut while keeping sort of as much thickness as they could, and they've really struck a very, very good balance on the thickness at the edge here, okay? It is S35 VN, and it does have a very nice stonewash finish, Hinderer's working finish, all right? So that's that blade. Now, this blade is M390 steel. It is a full flat grind, and it's called a slicer grind, and it basically means that the end of the knife is ground thinner than the front. So when they would put this on a grinder, they would be holding it with the tip a little closer, and they would be coming in. So if you imagine my hand was a grinder, you cant this knife this way and bring it into the grinder like that, rather than just hold it flat and do this, okay? Now, we could discuss the intelligence of that, whether it was a good design choice or not. It is a little bit backwards from what you normally want. I will say this knife still carries quite a bit of steel to the tip, but not nearly as much as the XM18, okay? So, which one is better? Well, again, it kind of depends on how you're going to use your knife, okay? There's no question, I don't think anyone is going to argue that the Spanto grind is not a very tough, very durable grind. So if you're going to do anything at all with this blade that could put torsional force on it, that is this kind of stuff, maybe some light prying, even really hard stabbing, you may want to go with the Spanto over the slicer grind. And that's probably true if you're buying an XM18 as well. This blade is a thinner grind. Now, the other thing to say about these two knives is if you're planning to have this as sort of a hard use tool, the Hinderer again comes ahead a little bit because of the fact that it's got that working finish. So you can put quite a bit of wear on this blade and it's not going to show, okay? Where this blade, because of that beautiful grinder satin, and it is beautiful, but I mean, you put a scratch in this blade and it's going to show up readily, and you're not going to get rid of it easily. Okay, so I guess the difference between these two is this one leans almost a little bit towards a gentleman's folder, and this is just a hard use, beefy tool. Okay, again, that's a matter of personal preference. Now for me, because of the ability to perfectly walk that line between toughness and cutting power, I've got to give the edge to the XM18 blade. Okay, because you do have a blade here that's tougher. Now I will say I like the steel better. The M390 is a phenomenal steel, so you know, I like the steel better on the 0560. But S35VN does not take second place to anyone very easily. It's a great steel, and because they've achieved such a great balance of toughness and cutting power, I'm going to give the blade just slightly to the XM18. Okay, now what about lockup and deployment? All right, lockup and deployment is one of those areas where these blades differ maybe more than anything else. Okay, they're both titanium frame locks. They both have over travel stops. Now the Hinderer does not have a lock bar, stainless steel lock bar insert, but the XM18, or I mean the 0562 does. All right, so that's an important difference that may be worth noting. Now at the same time, there's a slightly thicker piece of titanium in the lock here. The lock cutout is very, very close. The Hinderer might be just a little bit thicker. I don't think the strength of one of these locks is significantly greater than the other, okay? The way to achieve a stronger lock is, here's my ferrum forged Ferrex. This lock bar cutout is an achievement. I kind of wish all companies would copy this particular style of lock bar cutout. They've actually essentially designed an I-beam here so that they've kept a lot of strength while removing some material so that you can still unlock the blade. Although this is a stiff lock, it's not easy to lock and unlock, it is exceptionally strong. These are fairly similar, both pretty comfortable to lock and unlock. Okay, now what about, so lock strength and usability is very, very similar. What about deployment though? Here's a couple things that are different. Number one, the Hinderer has a weaker detent, but it's far smoother. So if you watch, the Hinderer will drop very nicely. The XM18, its ball bearing pivot, it does that annoying thing. It will drop, but it's more jumpy, okay? This just feels almost hydraulic. This feels fast and snappy, but not as smooth, okay? The other thing that should be pointed out is this is ball bearing versus non-ball bearing. Again, we're back to the philosophy of use. This is going to be a more durable style of construction. Ball bearings are going to lend themselves to the possibility, not the assurance, but the possibility of getting dirt and grime and crap in there. And some of my ball bearing knives, I have had that experience. So I'm not just making it up. I have had to clean the ball bearings out on some of my ball bearing pivot knives to get them back to a proper functioning. All right. So the Hinderer also, because of the weaker detent, it can be opened quite easily with the thumb studs, okay, or blade stops, whatever you want to call them, or it can be flipped. And the flipping is achieved by just being very, very smooth, okay? Now here, the detent is quite stiff, so you're preloading that blade, and by the time the detent breaks, yeah, it's going to flip open really, really hard. Now, you cannot use the blade stops to open this knife at all. I mean, I can maybe try it for you, but I've only gotten it to work for myself while I'm playing with the knife 2 or 3 times, so I'm not even going to bother. All right, so lockup and deployment are quite different. You have ball bearing versus non-ball bearing. You have stiff detent versus only a fairly light detent. You have extremely smooth, clean, flowing deployment. I mean, it just feels amazing, okay, compared to, yes, a snappier deployment, but not quite as precision feeling, okay? So which one do you prefer? Well, I will admit that I prefer non-ball bearing pivot flippers, okay? Or really knives in general. I prefer to not have the ball bearing pivot. I don't think it's the end of the world, and certainly I bought knives recently that have ball bearing pivots, okay? It's not that I'm like against it or that I hate it or I just would never buy one. It's just that I prefer the non-ball bearing. And I think this would still be a great knife if it didn't have the ball bearing pivot system. So when we compare these two, on feel and performance, I've got to give it to the Hinderer. On durability, I've got to give the edge to the ZT because of the lock bar insert. And I would like to see that lock bar insert. Now there are other ways, and probably these Hinderers are carbonized lock faces, so it essentially achieves the same thing. By the way, I've never had a problem, and I've never seen a lot of reporting of people having all these problems with their titanium frame locks because of lock wear. There are a few, but not that many. I think Striders tend to be the worst. And so that's kind of something to keep in mind. Yes, I like, it's sort of that preference, okay? I prefer the non-ball bearing. I also prefer the lock bar insert to be there. So there you go. That's lockup and deployment. What about the handle? Okay, the handles are very similar, size and shape, but when you get them in hand, there's really not much of a comparison. You can right away tell the difference. The ergonomics on the Hinderer are phenomenal. Okay, on the 0562, they're great, but they're not quite to the level of the Hinderer. So on just ergonomics alone, the Hinderer does get a bit of an edge. Now, on materials, okay, you've got G10 that's heavily textured. One of the things that adds, I think, to this, the feel in this knife, is the texture. It's really well done. It doesn't tear your hands apart, but it is extremely confidence inspiring, where you know you're not going to drop this. This carbon fiber is, of course, smooth. There is a G10 version that's going to be a little grippier. Okay, there is some jimping. Now the jimping on the bottom of the blade here that would maybe come into play. No, it doesn't really come into play anywhere. So they have put jimping here, and I really don't know why. There is jimping on the back of the blade, which is it's okay. But the difference here is, of course, that carbon fiber looks really, really sharp. Okay, there's no doubt that it looks really awesome. And this does have the option. By the way, you could do this with your Hinderer as well. And a lot of people have. I've thought about doing bronze on this particular knife. You can do aftermarket hardware or even extra hardware from Hinderer for your XM18. All right, and I may still do a bronze hardware on this knife. So, handle, the ergonomics are quite similar, okay, but the Hinderer does get the edge, and largely that's going to be because it's a thicker handle, therefore more hand filling, more distribution of force. Okay, there is a lanyard hole on the Hinderer. There isn't one on the ZT, but of course that bottom standoff could definitely be used for a there's a little bit of room. You could probably get away with using one of these standoffs for attaching a lanyard, although you'd have to be aware that you might cut it. Okay, now the last thing, of course, is the pocket clip. Both of these pocket clips function really, really well. I do really like the deep carry option on the 0562. Both of them are, or only the 0562 is reversible to left side or right side carry. The Hinderer, on the other hand, is tip up or tip down carry. So it's kind of a trade-off either way. If you are a lefty, you may want to go with this because, or buy a left-handed Hinderer. They do have those. Okay, so in terms of comfort and in terms of confidence in hand, this feels like an overbuilt, super durable tool. This, not quite as much, okay? Now I will add that if they did more of the 3D texturing like they used to, that would probably change this discussion significantly, because this feels amazing in hand, perhaps better than both of these, okay? Probably closer to the Hinderer, but this feels amazing in hand. So, what's my take on these two knives overall? These are both really cool blades. Obviously, if you're a big Hinderer fan, or if you're a little more of a knife enthusiast than a knife user, you may want an XM18 in your collection just because this is such an iconic knife and it's been so popular and so influential, okay? I think the influence of this knife is evident just here, as I'm holding two zero tolerance designs, both based on it. And we'd have to add the 0560, the 0566, the 0550, a bunch of, you know, the cryo and the thermite, and I mean, there's even another one that's this year based on the Eclipse, okay? The 0392. So there's lots and lots of Hinderer inspired stuff out there, okay? Now, which one would you buy? Probably part of that discussion just comes down to how much you want to spend, okay? Because there's a huge price difference in these two. The other thing is, what do you use your knife for? If you need something that's super hard use, then the Hinderer is going to have a bit of an edge. Not a huge edge, but a bit of an edge. If you want something that's fancy, that's collectible, that's really cool looking with all the modern features, maybe you just want to go for the 0562 even over the Hinderer and do something like what I've done and add the interesting decorative hardware. Okay, so there you go, guys. I can't really declare one of these a straightforward winner. For my own personal preferences, yeah, I like the XM18 a little better, but I tend to prefer larger, more hard use folders. If you're someone who, you know, prefers, it would be the same if we had two Sebenzas here, the 25 and the 21. I prefer the 25. Okay, it's a little harder use, it's a little more hand filling. Same idea here. Okay. And so your preference may be different. Maybe you prefer more of a gentleman's folder style blade, and in that case you may like the 562 better. Okay, now if you want a really big blade, that may throw a whole new wrench in the works, and you may be interested more in the 0560 overall. So there you go, guys. Both great knives, both great companies. I really like ZT. Of course, I really like Hinderer. I'm not going to have as many Hinderers as I am going to have ZTs just because of the price point and because of availability. But nonetheless, both really cool, and either one of these blades. I mean, if I see you on the street and I go, hey, what are you carrying? And you say a 0562, I'm going to say awesome blade. Same thing as if you say an XM18, although I might be a little more impressed by the XM18 just because they're not quite as commonly found. All right, there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and look forward to a further discussion. One of the things we didn't really get into is what are some of the things that go into buying this knife over this one from more of a philosophical standpoint, from a collector standpoint, you know, going for those very high-end production or mid-tech knives. All right, we'll talk about that in a different video. Talk to you later.